Everybody. I think we'll kick off now. I think there's still a few individuals who are connecting, but we'll allow them to do that while we get the introductions going on. Okay, so first of all, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the country, or in some, actually we have one person connecting from out of the country. So welcome to our first Military History Logistics Series event hosted by the Royal Canadian Logistics Service Association. My name is Peter Boyle, and I will be your host for this evening. Our intention annually is to run 3 of these professional development / interest talks, one around Remembrance Day, one around the logistics birthday in February, and another one in April as we draw the year to a close. For the first year, we're going to run two sessions as part of our first group. This is tonight's session on the logistics of the First World War, and next week we'll be looking at the national support element with Colonel John Conrad. A few housekeeping points as we begin. I would ask that you remain muted throughout the presentation, just so our speaker can not get distracted as we go. If you do have any questions, I'd ask that you put them in the chat, and I will assemble them to ask Gary at the end, just in case we have some common questions. I can group them together, and then Gary's not following things along in the chat. We will have an opportunity sort of to unmute and do general question and answer once we've gone through all of the chat questions that we have. This event is being recorded, so you're aware, and it'll be hosted on the RCLSA YouTube channel. I'll put that link in the chat so people can have a look at what's on there now. It's small but growing, and you might find some things of interest. If you do have any technical issues throughout the evening, you're not able to hear or anything, please email the address that you registered with. I'll put that in the chat as well, and I can connect with you offline to do some troubleshooting either by email or by phone, and we'll get you connected. So I'd now like to introduce the president of the Royal Canadian Logistics Service Association, Major Retired John Page, to give some opening remarks, and over to you, John.
Thank you, Peter. Good evening, fellow logisticians. And the last time I looked, the senior person that was available was Brigadier General Keith Osborne. So welcome, Keith. Nice to see. For those of you who don't know me, I've been the president of the Royal Canadian Logistics Service Association since September 2016. It has been quite the haul, especially with the last couple of years of COVID-19. But it's also introduced us to more technology becoming routine. I spent 40 years in uniform as a logistician, as a supply technician, and later as a logistics officer. Retiring in 2016, I currently work for the Directorate of Military Cooperation and Training here at NDHQ Ottawa, delivering training around the world as part of Canada's defense diplomacy mission. So I have a very interesting job, and I'm very lucky to have it. Not only am I the president of the RCLSA, but I'm also a member of the board of directors for the Conference of Defense Associations. We are presenting a series of webinars on logistics and logisticians as a form of professional development, and to contribute to our mandate of looking after all of the logisticians in the RCLS. Another thing we are doing is battlefield tour in the Netherlands. Originally, it was scheduled for April, May of 2020 to help the Netherlands celebrate their 75th anniversary of being liberated from the Germans. And of course, COVID happened and we've had to postpone, so we are remounting it now for April and May of 2022. We have plenty of spots. Our intent is to bring at least 30 sponsored military members currently serving, regular and reserve, and as many people who wish to come that are funding themselves. We'll be joined by Keep Them Rolling, a group of World War II vehicle enthusiasts, and they will be reenacting the delivery of humanitarian aid to the starving Dutch population behind Nazi German lines that the 1st Canadian Army actually did in the end of April and May 1945. So it should be very interesting, and that was named Op Post, and hence we are doing Op Post 2022. If you have any interest in coming, either as a paying member or as a subsidized soldier, please get in touch with me, and Peter will make sure that you have my email address at the end of this. So thank you. Please consider renewing your membership in the RCLSA, and back to you, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Please do monitor the chat. I'll put a few links in there throughout the evening, not to distract from Gary's great talk. But I think now we'll get on with the main event, the reason you're all here. I'd like to introduce our speakers. So Major Retired Gary Campbell is a former logistics officer. He served in all three environments and was posted from sea to sea to sea and points in between. His out-of-country tours were with Military Sealift Command of the United States Navy and the Ministry of Defense in the UK. He has previous service in the 3rd Battalion Royal Canadian Regiment, the London and Oxford Fusiliers, and the Royal Canadian Army Service Corps. His area of specialization are transportation and logistics, planning, and host nation support. He is a BA from the University of Western Ontario, an MA in War Studies from the Royal Military College, and a PhD from the University of New Brunswick. Military history is one of his great interests, especially logistics history. He has written several articles about this and has authored 2 books in the New Brunswick Military History series. His wife, Carolyn, is a former Air Force nurse. They have 2 married daughters and 4 grandchildren. His recreational activities include collecting militaria and membership in local historical groups and senior clubs. And he also volunteers the Royal Canadian Legion. So without further ado, Gary, I'm going to hand this over to you. And if you want to just share your screen, we'll make sure that's working. But other than that, welcome, and we look forward to hearing you, your talk.
Great, thank you very much. Before we get started, for all the Army logisticians in the group, happy birthday. This is the 120th anniversary of the founding of Canadian Army Logistics. So, happy birthday. And I shall continue from there. Hopefully everybody can see this. Okay, what I'm going to do is an overview of First World War logistics from a Canadian perspective. And Brigadier General Osborne has seen this before, so he can just sit back and relax and enjoy the show. Okay, I'm going to start talking a bit about theater level logistics, and then talk about a bit about the forming corps and their contributions to the war. And it should be interesting. The one thing I have always said about logistics history is logistics problems tend to repeat themselves. So in my opinion, if you have some knowledge of what has happened before and how the problems were addressed either successfully or not so successfully, it gives you an advantage as you deal with your own problems today or tomorrow. And so anyhow, think about that as we go through this presentation. In the First World War, there were 5 logistics corps involved from the Canadian perspective. You had the Canadian Army Service Corps, the Canadian Ordnance Corps, the Canadian Army Pay Corps, the Canadian Postal Corps, and the Corps of Military Staff Clerks. So the Canadian Army Service Corps was formed the 1st of November, 1901, hence our 120th birthday. And it was responsible for providing transportation, movements control, supplies, and barracks. It was a combatant corps, and this is very, very important to note. Not all logistics corps were. And that means an Army Service Corps officer, if he was the senior one on the scene, he could command whatever was going on, even though you had infanteers. For those of you who have ever watched the movie Zulu, that is why Chard, a Royal Engineer officer, took command of the post at Rorke's Drift, because the Royal Engineers were also a combatant corps, and he was the senior one there. The Canadian Ordnance Corps. It was previously known as the Military Stores Branch, and it was a civilian organization that was formed about 1870 when the British Army left Canada and left behind a large number of ordnance stores, mostly in Kingston and Quebec City. It was militarized on the 1st of July, 1903 as the Ordnance Store Corps. It became the Canadian Ordnance Corps on the 2nd of December, 1907. And it was responsible for providing clothing, weapons, ammunition, camp stores, vehicles, and their repair, with the exception of Service Corps vehicles. Canadian Army Pay Corps formed the 1st of January, 1907 from the Canadian Ordnance Corps. And obviously they provided pay services. Canadian Postal Corps, it had brief existences during the Northwest Rebellion and the Boer War. It was reformed on the 3rd of May, 1911 and provided postal forces or postal services to the forces. And we have the Corps of Military Staff Clerks. Formed the 1st of April, 1912. They provided train clerks to the headquarters and became part of the Service Corps in 1946. So they call the First World War a world war for good reason. And here's a map that gives you an overlook of what countries were involved. You have Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey in orange, and the other Allied combatants in green. Truly a world war effort, or a world effort. Now, when we talk about Canadians in the First World War, we tend to focus on France and Flanders. But you'll see from this, Canadians were many other places. Obviously, they were home in Canada. They provided garrisons in Bermuda and a garrison artillery unit in St. Lucia. Obviously, the United Kingdom, France and Flanders. In Salonika in the Balkans. And the Royal Newfoundland Regiment represented Canada, although they weren't part of Canada at the time, in Gallipoli. We had a force in North Russia around Murmansk, and of course the Canadian Siberian Expeditionary Force. So Canadians certainly got around during this conflict. The macro logistics of the First World War is interesting to look at. As you can appreciate, there was a massive demand for all types of supplies and materials. And these were sourced from around the world. You had frozen beef coming in from Argentina, frozen mutton from Australia and New Zealand, a lot of supplies being manufactured, say, in the United States before they entered the war. And they all moved directly to bases in the UK for furtherance to France and Flanders, or they went directly to the bases in France. So there is obviously a rapid expansion of manufacturers. Clothing, weapons, munitions, equipment, you name it, there was a great demand for it. But the interesting thing about our participation is that all members of the British Empire were integrated into the British resupply system. And the other thing is, because we were part of the British Empire, all of our logistics corps were mirrored on the British ones. So basically, you had a NATO standardized system before anybody ever thought of NATO. And it worked well to integrate what everybody did. Now, not all of the expansions into ramped up production went well. You've probably heard about the shell crisis of 1950. And the requirement for artillery ammunition obviously expanded beyond any expectation because it was scaled for mobile warfare and not the static artillery heavy battles that came out of trench warfare. So basically the British and the British Empire was running out of shells. So they're rationing the amount of shells a gun could fire per day. So what they did is they bypassed the normal procurement procedures, which were rather antiquated and slow, and created a Ministry of Munitions. And they very quickly expanded the manufacturing base. Anybody who could turn out an artillery shell got a contract to do that almost. And one example here in New Brunswick is the Cavity Foundry in St. John. So this out-of-the-box thinking provided the solution for this problem and for many others. They just cut through the red tape and did it. And here we have a picture of King George V visiting the shell factory. Look at those shells. I suspect there's more shells in that building than we have in the Canadian Forces today. So back to the war. As you know, the war was declared on the 4th of August, 1914, and the British Expeditionary Force immediately went to France with 6 infantry divisions, 1 cavalry division with the supporting corps troops. And the mobilization of the British Empire followed. Canada's contribution to the effort was 4 divisions for the CEF. There was a 5th division. It was being formed, but it was broken up in the UK for reinforcements. And the other major one was the Siberian Expeditionary Force. So let's look a bit more at the Canadian contingent. Called the 1st Canadian Contingent, later was known as the 1st Canadian Division. So how is it made up? You had about 18,000 all ranks and about 5,000 horses. It mobilized in Valcartier in August of 1914, and they created Valcartier Camp out of nothing. It then moved to the UK in Salisbury Plain in October of 1914. And I suspect you're familiar with the tales of a terrible winter on the Salisbury Plain, with rain and mud and damp and all the other uncomfortable things that happened. Then we went to France in mid-February 1915. And of course, all of the logistics units went with it. There was an Ordnance Corps advance party, and then with the main contingent, there was the Service Corps, other Ordnance Corps units, pay, postal, and clerks all went over. And this is the picture of Canada's Grand Armada as it sailed away from Quebec City in 1914. And it must have been quite a sight. You have all the steamers there with troops on board, naval escorts. A very, very impressive sight. So let's look at the logistics component of that 1st contingent in more detail. I mentioned an Ordnance Corps advance party went to the UK to set things up. The Service Corps consisted of a number of units. You had the Divisional Train, which was horse transport, the Divisional Supply Column, that was mechanized transport, the Divisional Ammunition Park, which was mechanized transport, the Divisional Reserve Park, which was horse transport, depot units of supply, working mainly at the bases, and railway supply detachments. The Pay Corps had a base pay depot unit, pay and record office that was set up in London. You had the postal people, and you had the ordnance. And an important aspect of the ordnance participation was the artificers and the armorers, and I'll say more about those later. Problems arose in the UK. As I said, the Ordnance Corps advance party helped plan the reception, but when the Canadian troops got there, there were problems with their equipment. The hastily manufactured Canadian equipment was not up to the requirements of campaigning. Maybe they would do for the occasional summer camp and maybe some weekend training, but not for hard campaigning. Clothing, boots, wagons, all had to be replaced with proven British equipment. And the infamous Ross rifles were officially replaced in 1960. And I think most of you have heard about the problems with the Ross rifles. In some ways, a very nice rifle, but it wasn't up to the rigors of combat. It didn't like to be dirty, and it was very fussy about the ammunition it took. So there were a lot of problems, and they were eventually replaced. None too soon, I think, as the soldiers would have thought. So to give you an idea of the approximate strength of the CEF logistics units, as you can see, the Service Corps was the largest one with 17,000 people, followed by the Ordnance Corps, followed by the Pay Corps, the Postal Corps, and I don't have a figure for the clerks. And of course, they suffered fatalities, as you can see from the right-hand column. Now, not all of those are directly related to combat. Many people died of disease. And towards the end of the war, influenza was a killer, as it started to claim lives with the Spanish, pandemic. So taking a closer look at the logistics units that were there, we'll start with the Ordnance Corps. And in common with the other corps, you had staff in the various headquarters. In the UK, they had both base and auxiliary depots. Now, in France, most of the ordnance work was done by the Imperial Army Ordnance Corps. However, the Canadian Ordnance Corps had armorers and watchmakers at the division, brigade, and battalion level. And that was very important because timing was essential when you were doing timed artillery shoots. And as you lifted the chute, the troops had to know exactly what time to move forward so they weren't caught in the artillery fire. So you had to have the watches working. You had to have the binoculars working. Very important work. And the Ordnance Corps also had 3 field units, 2 light field units and a medium one, because they had to maintain equipment, the weapons. They had to repair, say, the wagons of the various units other than the Service Corps. And there was a lot of essential work being done by them. Here we have a picture of one of the workshops hauling in a heavy howitzer for repair. And there's a lot of people hauling on that gun. That's why a lot of times they move these heavy guns around using steam traction engines. So the Pay Corps, so we had a chief paymaster and a command paymaster, and then paymasters for the Canadian troops in France, and of course, field cashiers. And in 1917, they absorbed the unit paymasters and pay sergeants. So they were all part of an integrated corps. And here's one of our more favorite moments of the day when we have a pay parade. Stand up, salute, get your money, and salute and move off. The troops were paid in local currency. So if you were in the UK, you were paid in pounds, and in francs if you were in France or Belgium. The Postal Corps. And of course, like the other units, it worked very closely with your imperial counterparts. The home depot was in London with various field post offices in France and Flanders. Another important function they did was redirecting mail sent to casualties. Not necessarily fatal casualties, but if you had been in France, been wounded, and you were in hospital in the UK, it's nice to get your mail redirected to you. They were progressive. Starting in November 1918, they used airmail for the delivery of priority mail to troops in occupied Germany. And mention the reason for that later on. But this wasn't the first time that air was used for resupply. The first recorded use of air for aerial resupply was to British troops in Mesopotamia, when I believe a British garrison was surrounded and cut by the Turkish Ottoman troops, and they resupplied them by air to some degree. And we have our field post office. Postie sitting there, reading a letter from home, looking quite relaxed. And we have the Corps of Military Staff. They were the professional clerks that were in the various headquarters, and they kept the headquarters functioning. But other than that, there's not a whole lot known about their detailed activities. And we come to the Army Service Corps. In keeping with the other corps, they had staff at various locations along the lines of communication. You had the depot units of supply and the railway supply detachments. the field bakeries and the butcheries, and the horse transport and mechanical transport companies. And just to give you a feel for the horse transport, the main vehicle was the Mark 10 wagon that carried about a ton of cargo. They used a variety of motor trucks. In fact, quite a wide variety. It must have been a nightmare to repair them. And normally they had about a 1.5 tons capacity. So the divisional train, which I mentioned, which was a horse transport unit, carried supplies between the refilling point and the units. And it consisted of 436 people, all ranks, and 158 wagons. Behind them, you had a divisional supply column that carried the stores between the railhead and the refilling point. And again, they had about 311 people and 71 trucks. There was a parallel system for artillery ammunition. So the divisional ammunition part, or divisional ammunition subpart, depending on what time of the war you were, carried ammunition between the railhead and the divisional ammunition column, which was horse transport, that was operated by the artillery. And it was about the same size as the others, about 329 all ranks with 76 trucks. Earlier, I'd mentioned Divisional Reserve Park. It carried 3 days hard rations and forage. And again, about 300 all ranks and 150 wagons. Now, it was designed to accompany the troops and it had their immediate reserve for open warfare. Obviously, that role wasn't needed during trench warfare. So they were reassigned to general transport duties. The Service Corps provided drivers to the field ambulances, both for motor vehicles and for horse ambulances. They also operated motor ambulance workshops. So that gives you a quick overview of what units were there and what they were doing. And here we have a picture of a divisional train on the march with their Mark 10 wagons and pairs of horses. So pulling back, let's look at the big picture, the Western Front. I'd mentioned the theater bases. And the main ones were at Calais, Boulogne, Le Havre on the coast, and up the Seine River at Rouen. And these were the main theater bases. And I said before, stores came in either from the UK or directly from overseas by ship. And it's hard for us right now to grasp the logistics. Oh, what's the right word? I'm not going to say burden, it's the logistics requirements of those supply depots. Probably the most telling one, if you look at Rouen, you start off at about 17,000 rations per day in 1914, and you're up to 1,300,000 by 1918. Similar increases in petrol and the same in fuel, wood, coal, things like that. There was just a tremendous throughput there. And the one thing that's hard for us to understand today or to appreciate is they did not have mechanical handling equipment then. Other than the winches on board the ships, everything was moved by manpower. That's why they had labor companies and they formed a separate labor corps just to provide all the manpower that was required to shift these stores around. A tremendous amount of effort. So how did things get from the base to the troops in the field? Well, we'll start off talking about the bases along the coast. And supply was a combination of push, but most push and pull, but mostly push. So what would happen each day, they would make up a divisional pack, P-A-C-K. that consisted of about 20 rail cars per division. And of these 20 rail cars, 5 would have rations, say 2 of bread, 2 of groceries, 1 of meat. 4 would contain forage for the animals. 5 would contain oats for the animals. There'd be 1 containing petrol, and 5 that would have coal or coke, mail, ordnance, MT spares, and other things. So once they had the pack organized, about 15 cars would start out each day from the bases. They would move forward through, say, an advanced supply depot where they would pick up other types of stores, or another place such as here where there was a source of wood supply. And basically, the additions would make up about 5 cars. So everything would be put together at the regulating station. So you have a pack of 20 rail cars per division, and they put 2 of these together to form a train of 40 cars. This would go forward to the railhead. And at the railhead, as I mentioned earlier, the divisional supply column, mechanized transport, would meet the trains, offload the trains, and move them forward to the refilling points. And here, the divisional train, horse transport, they do an exchange, and then the divisional train would move it forward. Get the grip on this thing here, to the first line areas, the DPs, where they would be turned over to the unit quartermasters to go forward. And this is how it worked up until April of 1918. And in April of 1918, they consolidated all the mechanized transport together. This was a great savings and made a great efficiency, because instead of having delivery on a commodity basis, ammunition versus everything else, it was all put together. So you had efficiencies of scale. And I was reading the war diary of the Canadian Corps Mechanical Transport Column. They had upwards of 900 or 1,000 task vehicles under command. Think of the flexibility in operations you'd have there. And of course, each of the various sub-corps, your Canadian Corps Troops units, motor machine gun brigades had their own company. Canadian engineers had their own MT company. Now, of course, you had the divisional companies that did the normal resupply down through the divisional units. And over on this side, you had the Canadian Corps Siege Park. And again, it fed the heavy artillery batteries. And these are the ones I was mentioning were moved around primarily by steam traction engines because the guns were that hard or that heavy. And the other good thing about having consolidated all the mechanical transport together is it gave a certain degree of flexibility when the breakthrough came, because you could consolidate the transport and assign it to the tasks that needed to be done. And the advanced commands. So trench warfare essentially ended in August of 1918 with the Battle of Amiens and the start of the 100 Days. And as the BEF and the other allies pushed forward through the German lines, the German troops were falling back, and we pursued them. Now, there's a little bit of a problem here. This is typical of the area around the trenches. This, I believe, is the Battle of Passchendaele. But it's a muddy morass. It's cratered, it's watery, it's a bog. And in order to get supplies forward, the engineers had to build roads through this. They had to repair damaged bridges because the Germans are trying to blow every bridge they could as they retreated. The railway troops had to build railroad lines so they could get the trains forward. to resupply the troops. And there was a horrendous effort, but it was done. To give you a feel of how things look, here we have a, I guess, a divisional supply column loading at a railhead. And again, as I said before, notice the extensive use of manpower, no mechanical handling equipment there. Although I understand forklifts were invented in 1916, 1917, they weren't in common use. And look at the roads they had to operate over. You know, what you have there is basically a plank or a corduroy road. And if you didn't have the planks there, you'd be axle deep in the mud. A lot of the shots I found and a lot of the things I read in the war diary talk about the divisional train picking up the stores at the railhead, contrary to doctrine, but that's what happened. And the advantage there is, if they could do the job, it meant the mechanical transport was free to do other tasks. And it became obvious quite early in the war that motorized or mechanized transport could go further in a day and carry more than the horse and wagons could. So while the divisional train was carrying supplies from the railhead, the mechanical transport would be out doing other tasks, and a lot of times they were hauling engineer stores. And in particular, gravel, because the engineers tried to keep the roads up, they needed gravel for the road bed. A lot of work there. Excuse me. And as you got closer to the front line, obviously conditions were not good for horses and wagons, so they switched to other means. And the mainstay in the front line area was light railways. Small wagons, narrow gauge, sometimes pulled by horses, or in this case, moved by manpower. I believe what we have here is some wounded being evacuated, and you can see some German prisoners helping. As you got farther forward, they reverted to pack animals or soldiers carrying it. And here is a good example of a Canadian invention in use. You see the Trump lines? It enabled soldiers to carry more equipment or more stores than they could otherwise. And for those of you who are familiar with barbed wire, you'll notice the curly pickets there that were screwed into the ground that they could hang the barbed wire on. And finally, the supplies get to the front line and the soldiers sit back and have a warm meal of some description. So I believe this is the assault at Vimy Ridge. We're all familiar with that. And it gives you an idea of the landscape that the troops were operating on. But the picture I like next is this one, where after the successful Battle of Vimy Ridge, our troops get a ride home in our Service Corps trucks, and it looks like they're appreciative. Other types of vehicles were used for troop lifts. And these are the London Omnibus companies. And basically what literally happened is they pulled London city buses and other cities too off the streets and sent them to France and Flanders to transport troops around. If it could carry anything, it was used. I'd mentioned the opening days of the war and the BEF deploying to France. And they met the Germans at the town of Mons in Belgium. And then they had to fall back because the German forces were a little bit too strong for them and they had to regroup. This is the true story on the retreat from Mons. Service Corps vehicles were attacked by German cavalry. A little bit of a hairy time, I would think. But as far as I can determine, the biggest danger to logistics troops during the First World War was artillery shell fire. And here you have some omnibuses under artillery fire. and there's no place to go. There's no cover, there's no place to run to. Not good. One episode I read in the War Diary, they were at an RP, and the trucks had just arrived, and an artillery shell came in, hit right in the middle of them, killed some people, unfortunately, threw some others in the air, damaged some vehicles. Once they cleaned up, they moved in the horses, did the load transfer, and carried on. And then one of the units had to bivouac that night in the open, and they were sprinkled all night by shrapnel. Some injuries from it falling from the sky, but fortunately no direct hits. Now, one of the things people talk about after a war are the honors and awards. And from what I can determine, this is what our logistics forces were given as honors and awards at the end of the war. If you go down the left-hand column, you've got Commander of the Bath, Commander of Michael and George, Commander of the British Empire, Distinguished Service Order, Order of the British Empire, and the Military Cross. These are mostly officer awards because there was quite a distinction as to who received what in those days. Member of the British Empire, Distinguished Conduct Member for non-commissioned members, second highest award below a Victoria Cross, Military Medal, Meritorious Service Medal, mentions and dispatches. And there was a lower level mention dispatch called a brought to notice. And finally, the foreign awards. Now, no Canadian logisticians won the Victoria Cross during the First World War. 2 members of the Imperial Army Service Corps did. One was an officer serving with an infantry regiment. Remember what I said about being a combatant corps? A service corps officer could move across and take over the duties of an infantry officer. No problems at all during that time period. But Masters, he was an ambulance driver. And look at his citation. Journey after journey, evacuating patients over a road consistently shelled and swept by machine gun fire, and even bombed by an airplane. A great deal of courage there. And he certainly deserved his award. Let's look at another one. James Osborne Dempster. He was a Canadian. He enlisted in the Imperial Army Service Corps as a private. They were recruiting in Canada for people with special skills. He was what we would refer today as a stationary engineer. So there was an ammunition train attacked by shell fire, caught on fire, and he and some other men cleared ammunition carts from the burning train. Again, a great deal of courage shown to do that, knowing that odds are pretty good things could blow up in your face, literally. Now here's the gentleman I would really like to know more about, Lieutenant John Dale Nixon, Military Medal and Bar. He enlisted in Valcartier in September 1914 as part of the 1st Contingent. He was an engineer mechanic. He served with the 1st Canadian Divisional Supply Column, and he was attached to the 3rd Canadian Field Ambulance as the sergeant in charge of motor ambulances. He was awarded 2 military medals. First one appeared in the London Gazette on the 31st of August, 1960. And as a rule of thumb, usually you can backtrack 6 months to figure out where he was and what he did. And about that time in the Ypres salient was the Battle of the St. Eloi Craters. So it's a good chance it happened there. His second military medal was gazetted on the 12th of March, 1918. And you move backwards and it looks like it was probably for the Battle of Passchendaele. The frustrating thing is that the war diaries of the Divisional Supply Column and the Canadian Field Ambulance do not mention anything that he did in these periods. But I expect very much, like other people, he was doing heroic things, evacuating patients under fire. Now, you didn't have to do heroic things to be recognized, such as the case of Armament Sergeant Major George H. Farley. Canadian Ordnance Corps. He was a pre-war regular, and he received the Meritorious Service Medal in 1st of June, 1970. We know he was an artificer with the 2nd Brigade Canadian Field Artillery, and his job was to keep the guns serviceable, had to keep the guns working. The guns were, some of them were old and worn out. There was a severe lack of spare parts. You had to make do and keep them firing. And the nice thing about him is that he kept a diary day by day of what he was doing, and it's available in the history of the Royal Canadian Army Ordnance Corps called To the Thunderer Herds of Arms. Just amazing things he was doing, and well deserving of a meritorious service medal. Now, at the end of the war, the 3 of the Canadian Logistics Corps were awarded the Honor Royal. You had the Service Corps, the Ordnance Corps, and the Pay Corps. This was a great honor, and it recognized their outstanding service during the war. The Canadian Postal Corps had to wait until their golden anniversary in 1961 to be awarded this honor. Don't know why that was. So to sum up the presentation, as you can see, logistics was an essential part of the war effort. If you didn't resupply the troops and give them the ability to fight, they couldn't have fought. And logistics permeated the battlefield. Logisticians were everywhere. Driving trucks, driving horses, repairing guns. They were there. And they overcame a wide and continually changing spectrum of challenges because no day was like the other. And you had to shift from the concept of open warfare to trench warfare, which was pretty static. And all of a sudden, Battle of Amiens in August 1918, it all changes. You're back to open warfare, and you've got to rejig everything you did because it doesn't work anymore. So I feel we should be proud of their achievements, and we should strive to emulate them. And we should also learn what they did, because I said earlier, you know, most logistics challenges have occurred before in slightly different forms, slightly different ways. But if you know how other people tried to solve these problems, it might give you a leg up when you try to solve your problem. So on that note, I will conclude my presentation. Thank you very much.
Gary, thank you very much. That was fantastic, and I learned a lot about the First World War logistics. But we do have some questions, so we're not going to let you off the hook quite so easily. So just going to take a few from the chat here, and then we can open it up beyond. Would you be able to comment on the personnel replacement system? Did replacements follow the supply chain you so eloquently described? And Colonel Conrad's just asked that.
Why, thank you. Yeah, sort of. What would happen? Typically, a unit would go to France, and I'll talk about the logistics services because the infantry one was different. The infantry one, instead of having a reinforcement system for most of the war, they just created a new battalion in Canada, sent it to the UK, and then broke it up for reinforcements. But for things like the Service Corps that I'm most familiar with, you go to the UK, you go to the Corps Depot and various other depots they had in the UK. Then you go to France to the Service Corps pool, and then you get assigned out to units. So you had sort of followed the supply chain to a certain degree, yes.
Okay, excellent, thank you. The next question, with mechanical transport being fairly new during the First World War, could you comment on, I guess we'll use a modern term, what were the VOR rates for mechanical transportation? Was it, did they have a lot of problems with these new trucks, or was it, were they easily maintained?
I wouldn't think so. And I don't have a good basis for saying that. But as I said, there was a wide variety of trucks. They basically took anything they could find. And you have that mix and match in there. It's going to be hard to find the spare parts you want. So yeah, I would say the mechanics had a pretty good task ahead of them trying to keep those vehicles on the road. But I really can't give you VOR rates. The thing is, I'm not quite sure how they worked then, but certainly during the Second World War, you'd have 2 spare task vehicles per platoon. So you could have 2 vehicles off the road, but you'd still be 100% ready for your mission task.
Okay, perfect. The next question we have is, did the Germans attempt to disrupt the chain beyond the ranges of guns? So for example, did they use air attacks or saboteurs to disrupt the supply chains?
That I don't know. There's not a whole lot about that. Obviously the Germans were out bombing logistics installations, but whether they focused on it or not, I really don't know. I haven't seen a whole lot about that. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. The next question we have, it is clear that the Canadian supply chain evolved quite a bit during the First World War. Volume, material, flow. Is there any available research that you're aware of that can discuss how that change was managed, especially with the huge growth in the, I'm sort of adding on a little bit here, the huge growth in forces?
Again, there's not a lot written about it. You go through the histories, say, Warren's, Wait for the Wagon. And they tend to focus more on the troops in the forward areas, the supply columns, the divisional trains, and it doesn't spend a whole lot of time talking about the evolution of the whole supply system. So I really can't give you a good answer to that because it really hasn't been discussed that much that I'm aware of. I'm sure administration wasn't that exciting, but you obviously had staff officers at all the headquarters working to make it happen. And, by and large, it did. Sorry, I can't give you any more because I just don't have that.
Great, no, thank you. The next question is, what was the procurement like for replacement supplies during the war? Obviously, supply chains were valued targets for Axis powers to hit. This would have been incredibly impactful and already stressed out supply system. Was procurement of supplies, resupplies an incredibly difficult process?
I suspect it is. First of all, look at the quantities involved. The mere quantities, as I showed you on the chart, escalated exponentially. So then you had to go find somebody who could provide that. And I suspect they were tearing things out of the woods to do that. So yeah, I would say supplies were hard to come by. They did what they could to ease the situation. Certainly, there were salvage companies that were busy salvaging used materials such as shell casings, used clothing, rifles, helmets, and things like that. So you didn't have to get new equipment all the time. You could recycle it. The same thing with dependence on food. They actually had divisional farms that were raising fresh food for use by the troops, so you didn't have to import it. But yeah, I suspect importing supplies put a great stress on the whole system. That's why you had rationing in the UK.
Okay, excellent. Next question's from John. How far forward were the field bakeries and butchers? Did the meat come forward on hoof or already as a carcass to be butchered further along?
No, the bakeries and the butcheries were at the base units along the coast. I suspect the animals came in on the hoof. They would butcher them and then ship them forward in the daily pack. The same with the bread. Numerous ovens making hundreds, thousands of loaves of bread every day to go forward.
Okay, perfect. I'm actually going to post a picture in a moment of a field kitchen pretty close to the front lines, and how they probably haven't changed a whole bunch from how in modern times. So that's the questions I think we have from the chat, unless I missed anything. But I think we're good to open it up. If anyone has any would like to unmute and ask any questions at this time, please go ahead. No questions? Maybe I've got one more if I can just jump in here, Gary.
Oh, sure.
Talk a little bit about the, obviously with horse transport, there was a close tie with what was then the veterinary corps. How were animals handled? Were they sort of in constant use, or did they get breaks? And I don't know if you're able to speak about that at all.
A lot of care was paid to the horses. They obviously had care at the first line by the drivers. They had the Army Veterinary Corps there to look after them if they were not well. They had an evacuation chain for sick horses back to recovery locations. They also had an extensive system of remounts, whereby they would purchase horses from around the world, move it into France and Flanders through the various remount squadrons, and then move them forward, both to the service corps, the artillery, and anybody else who needed horses for their job. So there's quite a good system there to care for horses because they were valuable.
Excellent. Another questions come in the chat. How are first line logistics structured? For example, like a battalion QM.
Don't really know, but I suspect somewhat like they are today. You know, you had the quartermaster who was a senior officer. Quite often the unit quartermaster had been commissioned from the ranks, and you had the NCOs who were assisting them. But other than that, I really haven't gone into that. It's a bit far forward.
Perfect. Okay, does anyone else have any additional questions for Gary?
You know, it was a very quick look at First World War logistics. And as I say, if you want to know more, I recommend Warren's book, Wait for the Wagon, which is a fairly good history of the Canadian Army Service Corps, and also the Royal Canadian Ordnance Corps history, To the Thunder His Arms. Both of them should be available in libraries or on interlibrary loans. You know, so if you're interested in the history of the area, I would recommend you get it out and read it.
Hey, Gary, it's Keith here.
Sure.
I just wanted to say thanks very much. An excellent brief, even better than the last time I heard it. So clearly you're doing a little bit of research in between the years, filling in the gaps and seams. Nice to see you doing well. Peter, thanks for taking care of this. John, Billy Briggs out there, and I see John Conrad is on deck for next week, and I'm looking forward to that one too, John. This is excellent, guys, that you're able to do this and improve our professional knowledge of this skill at arms that we have, and to sort of help and reinvigorate some pride that we have in our own service. So thanks again, Gary. You're a good man for doing this, and you too, Peter, for making the arrangements. And next week, lots of questions, and give the gears to Conrad because I know he loves it.
Perfect. Thank you very much, sir.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. If there's no additional questions, I think I'm gonna just see if John Page has any closing remarks, and if not, I I will just wrap things up a little bit.
Thank you, Peter. I really want to thank Gary for his presentation this afternoon to all of us. This is great. This is the type of thing that we need, as Darrell Keith just said, to help reinstill that esprit de corps in our members. So thank you everyone for putting this together, Peter and Gary, and I'm looking forward to next week with John Conrad. So thank you all, and good night.
Perfect. Thank you, John. And Gary, thank you very much for a great presentation. I think we'll stay online for a little bit if there's any individual questions you might have. And I'm still posting a few things in the chat and responding to a few people here. So I'll stay online for the next little bit. But again, Gary, thank you very much. And I hope everybody enjoyed this evening. It'll be up on the YouTube channel as soon as we can get the editing done. Have a great afternoon/evening.